I'm a front-end dev using React. Where do I start for pivoting to Web3 front-end? Hi guys, my name is Christian, and today we're going to talk about Web3 front-ends. Specifically, we have a community member called Romeo, and Romeo asked, "Hi sir, I'm a front-end dev using React. Where do I start for pivoting to Web3 front-end?" And that's a really great question, because contrary to what most understand, Web3 or blockchain technology, or at least decentralized applications or dApps or dApps, are heavily reliant on Web2 technologies. So if you're a Web2 front-end React developer or Next.js developer, you are in a good spot, and it's something that you can easily transfer over to Web3 if you use or study rather and learn these 4 things plus 1 bonus. So let's go over each one. In order for you to become a Web3 front-end developer, if you're a Web2 front-end developer, you must first, number 1, understand the communication protocol. How do you communicate with your smart contract for a specific chain or blockchain network? Number 2, how to send a transaction. In Web3, we call these requests as transactions and not just API requests. Number 3, how to optimize a transaction. So when it comes to Web3 front end, when you send a transaction, there are variables you can manipulate in order to increase the odds of your transaction landing. And that's what we call optimizing your TX. Number 4, you must understand transaction handling. So once your transaction is sent, how do you handle them? So I'll go over on this really lightly, very high level, just to get you started and for you to search for keywords and terms and to do the studying on your own time. And then bonus, find info. If you want to transition into Web3 as a Web2 front-end developer, you need to be able to find info, and I'll go over on that deeper in a while. So Romeo, if you're listening, this is for you. So let's go over number 1. Number 1 is understand the communication protocols. As an intro, this is how it usually is in Web2 front-end development. Web2, you have a front-end, and this front-end will send a request to an API on the back-end, typically via REST. There can be different communication protocols such as WebSockets, but REST is what we're going to use as an example. And then the BE returns a response. And this is your typical front-end to back-end interaction in Web2. How do you know what endpoints to call? Well, all you need is a docs. Docs. Or API docs. Let's imagine this is docs. Really beautiful docs. Now, how is it in Web3? In Web3, this is how it usually looks like. You have a UI or your FE. You have a smart contract on your blockchain network. And then you send a request from your FE to your smart contract. And this is typically in the form of a transaction. We call these requests state-changing requests as transactions. Okay? Because inherently, blockchains are a distributed ledger. So ledgers record transactions. So it's a transaction. And typically, these transaction requests are sent with different communication protocols. But the most common one, at least in my work and in my experience, is the JSON RPC. We'll go over that in a while. And there's something different other than the communication protocol and the payload, which is a transaction. In Web3, the way it is currently now in our industry, you need to compile your smart contract. And after you compile your smart contract, your framework or your tools will give you what I call an interface. And typically in Web3 front-end development, you send this interface to your front-end developer, so your front-end developer can consume this interface. So the interface is then consumed by the front-end developer to be used in sending these transactions. So going over, our first is to understand the communication protocol in which you can communicate with the blockchain network. And it is usually done by how? looking at the official documentation of the network. And as an example, we have here a send transaction documentation for Solana's JSON RPC. And as you can see here, it's an HTTP post request with a JSON body. And it's not your standard just I'll send an endpoint. Okay, I'll request to a URL. So, number one, official docs. Read the official docs for the COM protocol on how to interact with your specific blockchain. And then number two is you need to understand what data to send. So how do you know that? If you understand what communication protocol to use based on the standard documentation, then how do you know what data to send? Well, there are two ways we can achieve this in Web3 front-end development. Number one is through code. You can manually pack data based on the code of the smart contracts that you're going to interact with. So read the code and then understand, okay, I need to include this in my transaction. Or number two, you can ask for from your smart contract developer the interface that I mentioned a while ago, the interface. So this interface is an artifact that is generated by compiling your smart contracts. Then your smart contract developer sends this interface to your front-end engineer so that this interface could be imported into your front-end code, and it will help you pack that data so you can send it in a transaction. And there are two most common formats for interfaces when it comes to sending transactions in the blockchain network. First one is for ETH. They call it the ABI, or the Application Binary Interface. And for Sol, which is my favorite chain, and the chain I really specialize in, something that I work in every single day, is IDL, which is Interface Description Language. And both of this, ABI and both IDL, simply are a JSON file that informs your front-end code what data to pack into a transaction. So imagine a transaction is a ship. Okay, imagine a transaction is a ship, and then this ship has to have cargo. He has to pack a certain cargo, else he's gonna be rejected when he goes to the place he's going to. So when you send this ship or this transaction, this IDL or ABR, these interfaces will act as a list, okay? It'll act as a checklist. Okay, these are the data you need to pack. Pack this data, pack this data, pack this data. And once you pack all that data into your crate and you send it, then you're good to go. So that's number one. Understand the communication protocols in two ways. First step, read official docs so you know how to interact with the smart contracts on a certain blockchain network. Understand how they communicate. Is it JSON RPC? Do they have official HTTP API docs? Read that. And then number two, understand by going through the code what data to send in a transaction. What data do you need to pack? Or much easier, just ask your smart contract developer for an interface. Or in ETH, we call it the ABI or Application Binary Interface. In Sol, we call it IDL. So you send this like a ship, pack your data in a crate based on your interface, then you're good to go. So let's go over number two. Number two is how to send a transaction, which is very easy. Actually, this step is very easy. Step 2, 3, 4 are very easy. You just need to read. You need to research them so you're not in the dark. We're sending your transaction. Okay, so number two is how do you send the transaction? It's very easy. So how send DX? And the point here is that search for the tools you need or libraries you need for your front end in order to send these transactions. And usually the front end stack that is being used for building front ends in Web3 right now is React.js and Next.js. This is why most of the tooling in library you will see for sending transactions is written in JavaScript, because the most common front end is React.js and Next.js in Web3. So if you know React or Next.js, then you're in a really good position. And these libraries, for example, For ETH, it's called ethers.js, Viem.js, Viem, all right, Viem, Viem, Web3.js. In Sol, the entry point for most beginners is to use at solana/web3.js. So this step is just all about researching what tooling and libraries exist for you to send transactions to the blockchain network and the smart contract that you want to interact with. And then for ETH, it's usually ethers.js, Viem.js, or Web3.js. And in Sol, for most beginners, they will start with at solana/web3.js. So what's our number 3? Number 3 is how to optimize a TX. So how do you optimize a transaction? First, when we say optimize a transaction, what I mean by this is you need to once again go over the official documentations and research what variables do I need to manipulate in order to succeed with landing my transaction. For example, in Solana, we have something we call priority fees. You need to fix your priority fees so that your odds of landing your transaction has a higher chances of success, or so that you don't blow the bank, or so that you don't miss all your transactions. So when we say optimizing transactions, each blockchain network has a certain set of variables you need to manipulate and change depending on your circumstance in order to increase the odds of your transaction succeeding. And you must look for those in official documentation, such as like in Solana, there is a variable we call priority fees. So lastly, the fourth one, before we go into bonus, is you need to understand how to handle TX. Specifically, once you send your transaction, what are you going to do if it's being processed, if it succeeded, and if it fails? So you need to understand the things that are specific to a certain blockchain network. How do you interact with your components? How do you capture data? How do you wait for data or a success or an error when you're sending a transaction? And it's different across different blockchain networks. So you need to understand those, and this is something you can look over. Look for front-end development repositories that you can use as a reference for your own work. And then lastly, which is the easiest one, is find info. I added this because not a lot of Web2 developers understand that when it comes to bleeding edge tech or something that's constantly being innovated really fast because it's novel, it's new, it's nascent, there's not a lot of information there to guide you. Not a lot of articles, not a lot of videos, not a lot of docs, not a lot of tutorials out there to show you how things are supposed to be done. And I want to let you know, if you're transitioning into Web3 front-end development, this is normal, and that it is your responsibility to find the information that you need in order to succeed, and don't give up, because this is normal in nascent, really fast iterating technology. So my advice, or at least what I can give you, is that if you can't find documentations, write-ups, tutorials, or different information sources such as Stack Exchange, Stack Overflow, do not hesitate to go over these two things. The code itself, do not be lazy and read the code if you have to, just for you to understand. Reading code in Web3 is very standard. Your questions are unanswered in the docs, in the forums, but they're answered most definitely in the code, because that's the first thing that gets updated. And then number 2, in GitHub issues or discussions, because typically your problems can be something that other people already experience, and you can see it in the GitHub issues and GitHub discussions. Sure, they don't have articles around it. Sure, they don't have forums around it yet because it's nascent technology and it's moving really fast. But you can use code and you can use GitHub issues and discussions in the Web3 front-end development in order to find info, because it's standard and it really happens. And I want to let you know that it's normal. If you're going through a tough time finding information, it's normal in Web3. And being able to find information is a valuable skill as a blockchain engineer, even as a Web3 front-end developer. That's it, Romeo. I hope this was helpful, and I was able to give you an insight into how you can transition as a Web2 React developer into Web3 front-end development, also with React, because React is heavily used in the industry. So for my community, if you guys have more questions about blockchain engineering, about tech, you have more questions about careers in blockchain, about Solidity, about Rust and Solana, don't hesitate to let me know and I'll answer it and create a video and discussion for you. Thanks guys.